When Thurgood Marshall was retiring from the Supreme Court, he was asked by reporters whether or not President Bush should appoint another Negro. He said, not the wrong Negro, but President Bush appointed Clarence Thomas, and Clarence Thomas was and is the wrong Negro. Stay tuned for the big picture. Let me welcome you back to the big picture, and let me, as always, invite you to share. What we're trying to do is have a conversation about things that are meaningful and relevant. And let me get right to my position that I've taken unapologetically, and that is that Clarence Thomas is the wrong Negro to serve on the Supreme Court because he, in short, is not qualified. Prior to serving on the Supreme Court, he was a chairman or the chairman of the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And that's a body that was created by Congress to ensure that there is fairness, racial equity primarily, and then gender equity. And then we've kind of put some other categories on over the years. But primarily it was developed to ensure that there was racial fairness in the workplace. During his time, he allowed 9,000 cases just to linger and languish and not go anywhere. And no one who filed the claim essentially got anything done. But one way that you kill a policy that you don't like, if you are conservative, is that you appoint someone who is hostile to the policy. And that's what Reagan did. Appointed a black conservative, Clarence Thomas, and the EEOC was essentially dead during the entire time that he was the chairman. Now, but he's the wrong Negro because as it relates to the plight of African Americans, we don't need someone who looks like us only, and that's it, and that's sufficient. No, we need someone who have common concerns, common experiences, common goals and objectives, and a common sense of how we need to move forward. If that's the total requirement, if that's the total criteria, then Clarence Thomas doesn't meet that. Obviously, he's the wrong Negro. And he has shown himself to be the wrong Negro in terms of how he's voted. Let's talk about three cases. Number one, Adirondack versus Pena. And it's a case involving contracting and preferences and affirmative action as it relates to the U.S. government handing out contracts to do certain services and to provide goods. There was a contest of that policy, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The white majority companies were claiming that they were cut out of the process because of that 8% out of 100% that was set aside for minorities. And Clarence Thomas voted against African Americans and other minorities in that case. Then there was, during the Obama administration, Shelby County, Alabama, tried to change its voting rights laws or its voting ordinances so as to make it more difficult for African Americans and other minorities to vote. And there was a challenge, and the Justice Department, using the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, blocked Shelby County's attempts to change their voting laws. This matter was litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court, and you guessed it, Clarence Thomas voted for Shelby County and against African Americans, claiming that the sins of Shelby County in the past as it relates to segregation and poll taxes and other dubious methods, that was in the past, and now we have moved forward. In other words, that we were in a post-racial society. It is a bunch of nonsense, and you know it, but Clarence Thomas has chosen to take positions that are in stark contrast to the political reality, the reality on the ground. And that's what makes him the wrong Negro. And most recently, in the case of Flowers v. the state of Mississippi, which is currently before the U.S. Supreme Court, but there were oral arguments earlier this week. And in the oral arguments, probably the vast majority, there's 9 justices, 8 of them seem to be leaning in the direction of Mr. Flowers, who's an African-American convicted of murder 6 times for the same crime. You may wonder how that could happen. Well, it happened because it was discovered that the white prosecutor had systematically used Jim Crow tactics to block black people from serving on the jury, and therefore Mr. Flowers was denied due process. He was denied his 6th Amendment right to a jury of his peers. If you've heard me talk on this program the last few weeks, I've been talking about that because that's not something that's just going on in Mississippi. That's happening in Los Angeles. That's happening in Chicago. That happens every week in Orlando, Florida, where I'm in court very often and in trial. It happens every single trial that I have. White lawyers are trying to keep black people from serving on the jury. These are Jim Crow tactics. They are violative of the Sixth Amendment. And this is what this case was about in Mississippi. And all of the justices seem to be in support of Mr. Flowers and against Mississippi in terms of what happened in the 6 other cases. But there was one justice who seemed to be against Mr. Flowers. And you know who that justice was, Clarence Thomas. He is the wrong Negro because he simply cannot relate, or he chooses not to relate, to the obvious and the continuous struggle of black people to obtain equality in the United States of America. That's what I think, and that's the big picture.